The hearing room had the familiar stillness of a Senate chamber preparing for confrontation, the kind of quiet that never lasts once questions begin to sharpen. From the outset, it was clear this would not be a routine exchange of confirmations and pleasantries. Across the dais sat Kash Patel, measured in posture but visibly alert, while Schiff leaned forward with the practiced focus of a prosecutor who believed the moment favored pressure. What followed was less an interview than a stress test, not only of testimony, but of credibility itself. Every word would matter, and every pause would be noticed. Schiff opened by returning to Patel's prior commitments, reading them back with deliberate precision. He quoted assurances given during confirmation, promises that the FBI under Patel would not be weaponized, politicized, or used for retaliation. The framing was unmistakable. This was not about policy, but about trust. Schiff's tone suggested that trust, once broken, cannot be patched with generalities. And he wasted no time moving from promise to probe. Patel responded calmly at first, denying any involvement in retaliatory firings or disciplinary actions tied to investigations of Donald Trump or January 6th. His answers were narrow, carefully constructed, and repeated with minor variations. No one, he said, had been terminated for political reasons. Any disciplinary action, he insisted, stemmed from failure to meet professional standards. The repetition was intentional, but so was Schiff's refusal to let it settle. Schiff pressed harder, stripping away qualifiers, focusing on phrasing like alone and in part. He demanded yes or no answers, the kind designed to collapse nuance into recordable clarity. Patel resisted, accusing Schiff of setting verbal traps designed more for headlines than truth. The tension rose as both men spoke past one another, each convinced the other was evading rather than engaging. Observers could sense the exchange slipping from inquiry into confrontation. What made the moment combustible was not volume, but implication. Schiff suggested that if senior FBI officials contradicted Patel's account, someone would be lying. Patel refused to accept that framing, insisting he could only speak for his own actions. The exchange became a chess match over narrative control, not evidence. Each answer seemed to generate two more questions. As the focus shifted, Schiff pivoted toward Epstein-related material, testing Patel's claims of transparency. References to past media appearances resurfaced, statements replayed not for nostalgia, but for accountability. Patel acknowledged the existence of materials, but resisted broader conclusions about their meaning. The line between disclosure and interpretation became the new battlefield. And with victims' testimonies invoked, the stakes escalated sharply. By this point, the hearing had lost any pretense of neutrality. Accusations were not proven, but they were aired, and that alone carried consequence. Patel grew visibly frustrated, accusing Schiff of theatrics and fundraising by confrontation. Schiff, undeterred, continued to push, framing resistance itself as suspicious. The room felt less like a forum for answers and more like a collision of irreconcilable assumptions. This opening phase set the tone for everything that followed. Promises made under oath were now weapons in a public struggle. Questions were no longer requests for clarity, but tools to expose contradiction. Whether Patel's answers satisfied or alarmed depended largely on where one already stood. And the hearing, still far from over, was already slipping into history as something far more volatile than a standard confirmation. As the hearing moved into its second phase, the exchange grew less procedural and more confrontational, the kind of shift that signals both sides have stopped pretending this is about clarification. The questions were no longer exploratory. They were accusatory, designed to corner rather than illuminate. Senator Schiff's tone sharpened, not louder, but colder, as he returned again and again to the same point, whether Director Patel's denials were absolute or merely technical. Patel, sensing the trap, responded with disciplined repetition, refusing to concede language that could later be weaponized. The room felt locked in a loop, each man insisting the other was the one refusing to answer. Schiff focused on wording, drilling into phrases like "for case assignments alone," treating them not as semantics but as possible admissions. He argued that if discipline occurred even partly because of an agent's involvement in sensitive investigations, then assurances of neutrality collapsed. Patel pushed back, accusing Schiff of manufacturing ambiguity where none existed. To him, the line was clear. No one had been punished for the cases they worked on, full stop. But clarity, in hearings like this, is often in the eye of the beholder. The exchange grew increasingly tense as Schiff introduced allegations referenced in complaints, implying that senior officials had told a different story. Patel refused to address ongoing complaints directly, citing process and fairness, a move that only intensified Schiff's frustration. The senator pressed again, asking whether anyone making such allegations would be lying. Patel declined to label accusers, reiterating that he could only speak to his own conduct. The refusal to personalize blame became its own kind of answer. At this point, the dynamic shifted from inquiry to endurance. Schiff demanded yes or no responses, while Patel insisted the questions themselves were flawed. Each interruption built on the last, creating a rhythm of challenge and deflection that left little room for resolution. Observers could sense that neither man expected to persuade the other. The audience, not the witness, had become the real target. The atmosphere darkened further when the discussion pivoted toward Jeffrey Epstein and the handling of related materials. Schiff framed the issue as a test of Patel's commitment to transparency, replaying past public statements with surgical precision. Patel acknowledged prior remarks, but resisted the broader inference Schiff was clearly inviting. He maintained that the Bureau had released what it lawfully could and that conclusions about broader trafficking were unsupported by prosecutable evidence. That answer landed heavily, not because it satisfied, but because it inflamed. Schiff pressed on, invoking victims who had testified to broader networks, suggesting a disconnect between lived testimony and official conclusions. Patel responded carefully, emphasizing the difference between allegations and cases that meet prosecutorial standards. The distinction was legally sound, but politically explosive. To some listeners, it sounded like caution. To others, like evasion. The tension in the room was unmistakable. As the questioning continued, Schiff raised the issue of Ghislaine Maxwell's prison transfer, implying suspicious timing and motive. Patel rejected any connection, stating that such decisions fell outside his direct involvement. Schiff expressed disbelief, challenging the plausibility of coincidence. Patel countered by accusing Schiff of constructing narratives without evidence. The exchange teetered on the edge of personal accusation. The breaking point came when Patel abandoned restraint and turned the charge back on Schiff himself. He accused the senator of long-standing dishonesty in prior investigations, of public theatrics masquerading as oversight. His language grew sharper, bordering on contempt, and the room audibly reacted. Schiff attempted to regain control, but the moment had already escaped its procedural frame. What followed felt less like testimony and more like a political showdown. Patel's outburst reframed the hearing in real time. Supporters would later describe it as overdue candor, critics as an unacceptable breach of decorum. Schiff, for his part, appeared stunned but not silent, clearly aware that the exchange had crossed into territory that would dominate headlines. The chairman's gavel struggled to restore order as voices overlapped. The hearing had become a spectacle. By the end of this phase, any illusion of mutual respect had evaporated. Schiff's strategy of pressure had exposed Patel's defensiveness, while Patel's counterattack had exposed Schiff's vulnerability to charges of politicization. Neither man emerged unscathed, and neither seemed particularly concerned. The damage, whatever its final form, was already done. And as cameras cut away, it was clear that the most consequential part of the hearing would not be decided in that room, but in how the confrontation would be replayed, interpreted, and remembered. The tension in the hearing room did not fade as the questioning continued. If anything, it thickened, settling into the kind of silence that signals everyone understands something important is unfolding. The exchange was no longer about clarifying testimony or filling gaps in the record. It had become a direct struggle over who the public should believe, and neither side showed any interest in softening their ground. When the discussion returned to Jeffrey Epstein, the shift in tone was immediate. This was no longer an abstract debate about standards or internal policy. The name alone carried weight, history, and unresolved anger. The questions sharpened, and the answers became more guarded. Every sentence now risked being interpreted as either evasion or accusation. Schiff pressed on the apparent contradiction between official conclusions and public testimony from victims. He framed the issue not as a legal technicality, but as a matter of credibility. How, he asked in essence, could so many accounts exist while official action pointed in only one direction? The implication hovered without being stated outright. Was the truth being narrowed to fit what could be prosecuted? Patel responded by drawing a hard line between moral outrage and legal proof. He acknowledged the gravity of the crimes while refusing to promise conclusions not supported by evidence that could survive court scrutiny. To him, restraint was not denial, but responsibility. He emphasized that law enforcement cannot operate on inference alone, no matter how disturbing the allegations. That distinction, however, landed uneasily in the room. The clash exposed a fundamental divide. One side spoke as though truth emerges from patterns, testimony, and unanswered questions. The other spoke as though truth only exists once it meets prosecutorial thresholds. Both positions carry authority, but they collide when placed side by side. And in that collision, frustration grows. When the topic turned to Ghislaine Maxwell's prison transfer, suspicion replaced abstraction entirely. The timing raised eyebrows, and Schiff made sure that discomfort was audible. He questioned how such a move could be unrelated to recent interviews and renewed scrutiny. Patel rejected the premise outright, distancing himself from the operational decision. Coincidence, he argued, should not be mistaken for conspiracy. The exchange grew sharper with each interruption. Schiff appeared unconvinced, his skepticism clear even when his words remained controlled. Patel grew increasingly irritated by what he described as narrative building rather than oversight. Both men spoke as if the other were deliberately missing the point. The room absorbed the friction in silence. Then the tone shifted decisively. Patel stopped defending and began attacking. He accused Schiff of long-standing politicization, of turning oversight into performance. The words were no longer measured. They were charged. The transformation from witness to accuser happened in real time. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs spread through the room. The chairman attempted to restore order, but momentum had already taken over. Schiff tried to reassert control, yet the exchange had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer procedural conflict. It was personal. What made the moment so striking was not the volume, but the finality. Patel spoke as though years of frustration were being compressed into a single response. Schiff listened with visible tension, aware that the narrative had shifted. Supporters on both sides recognized the turning point instantly. This was the clip that would circulate. At that stage, neither man seemed concerned with de-escalation. Each appeared to accept that damage, once done, would serve a purpose. Patel framed himself as resisting weaponized oversight. Schiff framed himself as exposing evasive power. The audience was left to decide which framing felt more credible. By the time the exchange slowed, the hearing had transformed entirely. It was no longer about confirming facts. It was about defining character. The questions, the answers, and the outbursts would now live far beyond the chamber, and whatever followed would be judged not just by what was said, but by how it was remembered. What followed was not resolution, but aftermath. The room carried the residue of what had just been said, a kind of political aftershock that no gavel could fully calm. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, aides leaned toward one another, and the cameras lingered longer than usual. Everyone understood that the substance of the exchange was now secondary to its symbolism. This was no longer just a hearing, it was a signal. Patel framed his position as a defense of institutional integrity. He spoke as though the FBI itself were on trial, not just his leadership. In his telling, accusations of retaliation were part of a broader attempt to undermine law enforcement credibility. He emphasized standards, oaths, and mission, repeating them like anchor points. The repetition was deliberate, meant to project stability amid the chaos. Schiff, by contrast, leaned into persistence rather than volume. He did not raise his voice, but he refused to let the moment slide. Each follow-up question was shaped to close off escape routes, narrowing the space for ambiguity. His approach suggested that the truth, when pressed patiently, eventually surfaces. Whether that patience would be rewarded remained unclear. The audience watching from home saw something else entirely. They did not see footnotes or internal memos. They saw two powerful figures accusing each other of bad faith in real time. For some viewers, Patel looked like a man finally pushing back against years of political theater. For others, Schiff looked like the last barrier between power and unaccountability. The Epstein issue lingered over everything, even when it was no longer mentioned directly. Its shadow gave every answer an added layer of suspicion. Any claim of transparency was weighed against years of secrecy and delay. Any denial was measured against the testimonies already etched into public memory. That tension was impossible to escape. What made the exchange especially combustible was the absence of closure. There was no definitive answer that could end the debate cleanly. Instead, there were competing realities offered side by side. One emphasized legal sufficiency and prosecutorial restraint. The other emphasized moral urgency and public trust. As the hearing moved forward, the questions became less about specific actions and more about intent. Did leadership mean insulating institutions from political pressure, or confronting that pressure openly? Was neutrality possible in an environment already saturated with partisanship? Could transparency exist without feeding spectacle? These were questions no witness could answer definitively. Patel's final remarks leaned heavily on defiance. He portrayed himself as unmoved by criticism and uninterested in appeasement. The message was clear. Accountability would be defined internally, not dictated externally. To supporters, that sounded like strength. To critics, it sounded like insulation from scrutiny. Schiff's posture remained controlled but unyielding. He did not match the rhetoric, but he did not retreat from the implications either. His silence at certain moments spoke as loudly as his questions. It suggested confidence that time, documents, and continued oversight would do the work words could not. Whether that confidence was justified was left unresolved. By the end, The hearing had accomplished something unintended. It stripped away the illusion that this was a narrow dispute over procedure. What was exposed instead was a deeper struggle over power, trust, and narrative control. The arguments would continue long after the microphones were turned off, and the public would be left to decide which version of events felt closer to the truth. As the hearing edged toward its final moments, it became clear that nothing said that day would settle the dispute. Instead, the exchange had opened a wider argument that now belonged to the public as much as to the Senate. What lingered was not a single quote or accusation, but a mood of unresolved confrontation. The sense that something fundamental had been exposed, without being fully explained, hung in the air. That kind of ending rarely brings calm. Outside the chamber, reactions split along familiar lines. Supporters of Patel argued that he had finally said out loud what many believed quietly, that oversight had drifted into theater. They saw his refusal to answer on someone else's terms as an act of resistance rather than evasion. To them, the sharpness of his words was overdue. It felt less like a breakdown and more like a line being drawn. Critics saw it differently. They argued that defensiveness had replaced transparency, and aggression had replaced clarity. For them, the refusal to give direct answers raised more questions than it resolved. They pointed to the tone as evidence that accountability was being treated as hostility. In their view, that was precisely the problem. What made the moment particularly powerful was how little it relied on new information. There were no shocking documents revealed, no unexpected admissions. The drama came from interpretation rather than discovery. It was about how power responds when pressed, and how oversight reacts when resisted. That dynamic resonated far beyond the specifics of the hearing. The Epstein issue remained the emotional core of the confrontation. Even without definitive conclusions, its gravity shaped every exchange. The public's long-standing frustration with secrecy amplified skepticism toward official assurances. Each claim of completeness was weighed against years of unanswered questions. That imbalance ensured the issue would not fade quietly. As analysts began dissecting the hearing, attention shifted from facts to posture. Who appeared composed? Who appeared defensive? Who appeared credible? Body language, tone, and timing were replayed and debated endlessly. In the age of clips and commentary, substance often travels alongside spectacle. This hearing provided plenty of both. The broader implication was impossible to ignore. If institutions insist on strict legal thresholds while the public demands moral clarity, tension is inevitable. Neither side fully satisfies the other. The law moves carefully, while public outrage moves quickly. That gap is where mistrust grows. By refusing to soften his stance, Patel signaled that future confrontations would likely follow the same pattern. No concessions, no rhetorical retreat. Schiff, by maintaining pressure without escalation, signaled persistence rather than surrender. Both approaches suggested this was not a one-time clash. It was the beginning of a longer campaign. In the end, the hearing did not answer the biggest questions. It sharpened them. Who decides when transparency is sufficient? Who defines the boundary between oversight and politicization? And how much patience the public still has for explanations that feel incomplete? As the room emptied and the cameras powered down, one thing was undeniable. The confrontation had already escaped the confines of the Senate chamber. It was now part of a larger conversation about trust, power, and accountability in American politics. That conversation would not end with a gavel strike. It would continue, louder and more polarized, long after the hearing itself faded from view. The political significance of what unfolded did not lie in any single answer, but in the way the exchange reinforced existing doubts on all sides. For years, public confidence in institutions has been eroding not because of one scandal, but because of accumulated moments like this. Moments where questions are asked plainly and answers arrive wrapped in conditions, definitions, and procedural framing. To some, that sounds like professionalism. To others, it sounds like distance. In the days following the hearing, the language used inside the chamber began to echo far beyond it. Supporters clipped Patel's sharpest lines and circulated them as proof of resolve. Opponents clipped the same moments and framed them as deflection. The same sentences were repackaged into entirely different meanings, depending on who was listening. That alone told a story. What was striking was how quickly the focus shifted from what had been said to what had been avoided. Viewers fixated on pauses, on phrasing, on the repeated narrowing of definitions. Every instance of precision was scrutinized for motive. Was it caution, or was it concealment? The ambiguity fueled speculation rather than settling it. Schiff's strategy appeared to rely on endurance rather than immediacy. He did not need the hearing to deliver a decisive moment. He needed it to create a record, one that could be revisited, compared, and tested over time. In that sense, the lack of closure was not a failure. It was part of the design. Patel's strategy, by contrast, emphasized finality in tone even when finality in substance was impossible. By rejecting the premise of politicized retaliation outright, he closed the door rhetorically. There would be no partial admissions, no rhetorical concessions. That approach projected certainty. But certainty, when confronted with lingering doubt, often invites further challenge. The deeper issue at play was trust. Not trust in one individual or one agency, but trust in process itself. Can the public accept that some truths are legally unreachable even when they feel morally obvious? Can institutions expect patience in an era conditioned for immediacy? These questions hovered beneath every exchange, unspoken but unavoidable. They remain unresolved. As media coverage continued, commentators began asking a more uncomfortable question. What happens if neither side is lying, but both are speaking from incompatible frameworks? One rooted in law, the other rooted in accountability. In such a scenario, confrontation becomes inevitable, not because of bad faith, but because of collision. That possibility unsettled even seasoned observers. The Epstein files, regardless of their contents, had become symbolic. They represented a promise repeatedly made and repeatedly delayed. Each delay magnified suspicion, even when explanations were legally sound. The public no longer judged transparency by intent, but by outcome. Anything short of full disclosure felt insufficient. Against that backdrop, Patel's insistence on evidentiary limits sounded increasingly isolated, not necessarily wrong, but out of sync with public expectations. Schiff's insistence on continued pressure, meanwhile, risked being dismissed as performative by those already cynical. Both risks were real. Neither could be avoided. What remained after the hearing was not clarity, but momentum. More requests, more filings, more statements. The confrontation ensured that the issue would not quietly disappear into committee archives. It had been elevated into a defining conflict, and defining conflicts rarely resolve quickly. In the end, the most accurate description of the moment was not scandal or spectacle, but exposure. Exposure of how fragile the balance between power and oversight has become. Exposure of how differently truth is defined depending on who is speaking. Exposure of a system straining under the weight of public mistrust. That exposure, once revealed, cannot easily be undone. As this chapter closed, one reality was clear. No single hearing would restore confidence or erase suspicion. But each confrontation adds pressure, and pressure changes outcomes over time. Whether that change leads to reform or further division remains to be seen. What is certain is that the conversation is far from over. The aftermath continued to unfold in layers, each one reinforcing how deeply polarized the moment had become. What might once have been dismissed as a tense committee exchange was now treated as a litmus test for institutional credibility. Every statement was replayed, slowed down, and analyzed for subtext. Even silence became evidence to those determined to find meaning in it. In modern politics, nothing simply ends when the hearing adjourns. Behind the scenes, both camps moved quickly to shape interpretation. Briefings were held, statements were refined, and allies were activated. The goal was not to change minds overnight, but to harden existing beliefs. In that sense, the confrontation served its purpose for both sides. It drew clear lines and forced audiences to choose which version of reality felt more plausible. What complicated matters was the absence of a clean villain or hero. There was no single revelation that could settle the debate definitively. Instead, there were fragments, timelines, and competing standards of proof. That complexity frustrated viewers who wanted certainty. And frustration, when sustained, often turns into suspicion. The conversation also exposed a broader fatigue with institutional language. Phrases like procedure, jurisdiction, and threshold no longer reassured the public the way they once did. To many, they sounded like shields rather than explanations. That perception may be unfair, but it is powerful. And politics operates as much on perception as on fact. At the same time, there was visible exhaustion on the oversight side as well. Repeated demands for transparency had not delivered the clarity promised. Each round of questioning produced more qualifiers than conclusions. The cycle began to feel endless. Pressure increased precisely because resolution remained elusive. The Epstein issue continued to act as a catalyst rather than a conclusion. Its unresolved nature kept reopening old wounds and old doubts. Every assurance that nothing more could be done invited renewed scrutiny. The longer the distance between promise and disclosure, the louder the skepticism grew. Trust, once strained, does not recover quickly. What emerged most clearly was a shift in expectations. The public no longer accepts that legality alone is enough. They want moral alignment, emotional acknowledgement, and visible effort. Institutions, however, are built to move cautiously, not cathartically. That mismatch defines much of the current tension. As days passed, attention turned to what would come next, rather than what had already happened. Requests for additional documents resurfaced. Calls for further hearings grew louder. Commentators speculated about resignations, reforms, or retaliation. None of it was certain, but all of it was plausible. In this environment, every future action will be interpreted through the lens of that confrontation. Any delay will be seen as confirmation of suspicion. Any disclosure will be scrutinized for incompleteness. Any refusal will be framed as defiance, as the margin for neutral interpretation has narrowed dramatically. The deeper consequence may not be legal or procedural, but cultural. Each clash like this reinforces the idea that truth is partisan, that evidence is negotiable, that oversight is performance and defense is deception. Once those assumptions take hold, rebuilding trust becomes exponentially harder. Yet even amid the cynicism, the confrontation served a function. It forced uncomfortable questions into the open. It made clear that patience has limits. It reminded institutions that authority without credibility is fragile. And it reminded lawmakers that credibility without restraint can collapse into spectacle. As this episode settles into the political record, it will be remembered less for what it proved and more for what it revealed. A system under strain, a public demanding more than process, leaders speaking past each other from incompatible frameworks, and a conversation that shows no sign of ending quietly. What comes next will not be decided in a single vote or filing. It will be shaped by accumulation, by pressure applied repeatedly over time. Each hearing, each release, each refusal will add weight. Eventually, something will shift. Whether that shift brings clarity or deeper division remains the unanswered question hanging over everything. The longer the dispute lingered, the more it began to resemble a slow-burning test of endurance rather than a search for resolution. Neither side appeared willing to blink, and that mutual refusal carried its own logic. Backing down now would not look like prudence, it would look like admission. In an environment already saturated with suspicion, perception mattered as much as proof. So the standoff hardened. Inside Washington, the conversation quietly shifted from what happened to what it signaled. Staffers spoke less about transcripts and more about precedent. If this kind of confrontation became normalized, future hearings would not be calmer. They would be harsher. Each side would arrive prepared not just with facts, but with counters to anticipated narratives. Oversight would increasingly resemble combat training. Outside Washington, the effect was different, but no less significant. Viewers did not parse legal nuance the way committees do. They responded to tone, confidence, and defiance. For many, the hearing reinforced a belief that institutions speak a language ordinary people no longer trust. That gap widened with every carefully worded non-answer. The absence of a definitive endpoint became its own story. There was no moment when the issue felt resolved or even paused. Instead, it hovered, resurfacing in interviews, op-eds, and campaign rhetoric. Each reference pulled the confrontation back into focus. It became a touchstone rather than a chapter. What complicated matters further was how easily the dispute fit into broader cultural anxieties. Concerns about secrecy, power, and accountability were already simmering. This exchange did not create those fears, it amplified them. It gave them a recognizable face and a recent timestamp. That made them harder to dismiss. Even attempts to move on were interpreted through suspicion. Silence was read as calculation. Focus on other issues was read as diversion. There was no neutral ground left. Every action or inaction carried implied meaning. Over time, the language surrounding the confrontation began to harden. Words like oversight and transparency gave way to phrases like cover-up and witch hunt, depending on the speaker. The middle ground shrank rapidly. Once debates adopt that vocabulary, compromise becomes politically dangerous. No one wants to be seen conceding to bad faith. Yet beneath the noise, a quieter question persisted. What would actually satisfy the public at this point? Would additional documents restore confidence or merely invite new doubts? Would further hearings clarify anything or simply deepen polarization? The answer was far from obvious. Institutions tend to rely on time as a solvent for controversy. But time, in this case, seemed to intensify scrutiny rather than dilute it. The longer questions lingered, the more symbolic they became. They stopped being about specific decisions and started being about trust itself. And trust does not respond well to delay. As the weeks passed, the confrontation took on a life of its own. It was cited in unrelated debates as evidence of systemic failure or principled resistance. Its details blurred, but its emotional imprint remained sharp. That is often how political moments endure, not through accuracy, but through resonance. What this episode ultimately demonstrated was not the weakness of any one individual, but the fragility of shared assumptions. Assumptions that institutions act in good faith. Assumptions that oversight is neutral. Assumptions that transparency has a clear definition. Once those assumptions fracture, every interaction becomes adversarial. There was no clean ending to mark the close of this chapter. No statement that could draw a line under the dispute. Instead, it faded into the background, while continuing to shape the foreground. It influenced tone, strategy, and expectation going forward. That is how unresolved confrontations persist. In the end, the most lasting impact may not be legislative or legal, but psychological. A growing sense that accountability is always contested and clarity is always conditional. That sense lingers long after hearings conclude. It reshapes how future questions are asked and how answers are received. And once that shift occurs, it is very difficult to reverse. And so the moment settles, not with resolution, but with a quiet unease that refuses to fade. No verdict was delivered, no confession extracted, no single sentence spoken that could close the book on what unfolded. Instead, what remains is a lingering question about how power responds when it is pressed, and how truth is measured when certainty is in short supply. That question does not belong to any one party, institution, or individual. It belongs to the public now. The exchange will be remembered less for its specifics than for what it revealed about the state of American politics. A system where procedure and perception increasingly collide, where legal precision can sound like evasion, and moral urgency can sound like accusation, where speaking carefully is no longer enough, yet speaking forcefully carries its own risks. That tension defines the era. For some viewers, the confrontation looked like overdue resistance to performative oversight. For others, it looked like accountability being met with defensiveness. Both interpretations can exist at the same time, and that may be the most unsettling part. When the same moment reinforces opposing beliefs, consensus becomes nearly impossible. And without consensus, trust erodes. What comes next will not be decided by a single document release or another round of questioning. It will be shaped by patterns, by consistency, and by whether actions align with promises over time. Transparency is not a moment. It is a habit. So is skepticism. Once either takes hold, it does not let go easily. In the end, the real story is not about who spoke louder or who landed the sharper line. It is about a public watching closely, less willing than before to accept explanations at face value. A public asking not just what is legal, but what is right. Not just what is said, but what is done. And that audience, once engaged at this level, rarely looks away again. The hearing is over, the cameras are off, and the chamber is quiet. But the questions raised that day did not leave with the gavel. They linger, waiting to be answered not with words but with time, action, and consequence. Whether those answers ever fully arrive remains uncertain. And it is that uncertainty more than anything else that will continue to shape the conversation going forward.